There again. It's some while since I've spoken about the depredations of the African slave traders who routinely raided England in the 17th century and who dominated the English Channel for years, as well as establishing a base on the Isle of Lundy in the Bristol Channel. Of course, we were not the only European country to suffer from their activities. Parts of the Spanish and Italian coasts became deserted because nobody dared to live there, and raids were carried out as far away as Iceland. These slavers were from North African territories such as Tunisia and Algeria, which were nominally at least part of the Ottoman, that is to say Turkish Empire. English ships were boarded in the Channel, and the passengers and crew carried off to Africa to be sold as slaves. The seas around Devon and Cornwall were full of ships of all shapes and sizes in the early years of the 17th century. Fishing was of course a major livelihood at that time, and there was no shortage of merchant ships either. Some of these were travelling to and from the New World, and there were rich pickings to be had. Not only were there valuable cargoes, but also crews and passengers who could be sold in the slave markets of Algiers and Tripoli. If there were not enough ships around to make an expedition worthwhile, then the villages and towns scattered along the edge of the sea could be raided, and if nothing else, there were sure to be men, women, and children there who could be taken aboard and shipped to Africa. It seems almost beyond belief that this terrible period of English history could have been forgotten, but there it is. Let's look at some specific incidents from the time. Between 1609 and 1616, a total of 466 English ships were boarded and the crews taken to North Africa as slaves. In April 1625, three ships from Cornwall and one sailing from Dartmouth in Devon were captured by slave traders and their crews taken. The following month, an entry in the calendar of state papers lamented that "the Turks are upon our coasts. They take ships only to take the men to make slaves of them." Because the Barbary coast of North Africa was part of the Ottoman Empire, whose caliph was in Turkey, all Muslims were regularly referred to in England at this time as Turks. The bold seizure of English vessels was bad enough, but there was much worse. The Royal Navy not only seemed to be unable to protect English ships at sea, even those close to the coast, they couldn't prevent slavers actually landing and taking people onto their ships to be transported to the slave markets of Algiers. In August 1625, a raiding party landed at Mounts Bay in Cornwall. The villagers saw the ships at anchor and fled for safety to the local church, but this wasn't enough to save them. The slavers dragged 60 people out of the church, loaded them into their rowing boats, and took them on board the waiting ships. They all ended up in the slave markets of North Africa. That same month, on 12th of August, the Mayor of Plymouth wrote to the Privy Council in London. He pleaded for assistance from the Navy because in 10 days 27 ships had been taken, and all the men on board, over 200 of them, had been made slaves. Ireland also suffered from the ravages of the slavers. In 1631, Baltimore was a small village on the southernmost tip of Ireland. In the middle of June that year, a fishing boat captained by a man called John Hackett had been boarded in the Irish Sea, and fearing that he would be taken to a life of slavery in North Africa, Hackett struck a deal with his captors. In return for his own freedom, he would guide them to a sleepy little village which they could take by surprise, and then catch as many victims as they pleased. On the night of 20th of June, he went ashore with a landing party and led them to Baltimore. A total of 89 women and children and 20 men were taken prisoner that night and endured a journey of 38 days before they arrived in Algiers, where they were sold to the highest bidder. Some of the men ended up as galley slaves. The children were separated from their mothers and most converted to Islam. Women either were employed as seamstresses or they became concubines. I thought that we might reflect upon this part of English history in the light of increasingly strident demands for reparations for the slave trade which are being made by African Americans and Caribbeans. If it is true that such events in the past are a wrong which can only be righted by monetary compensation, then surely the same applies to the actions of the Turkish Empire in and around the British Isles. True, there has been no Turkish Empire since 1918, but then too we disposed of most of the British Empire 75 years ago, and that hasn't stopped various countries pursuing us for supposed debts relating to the slave trade. It would, I think, be only fair if we and Ireland banded together now to make similar demands of Turkey for reparations for their part in the slave trade which inflicted such harm on our people.